So to get to tonight's speaker, as you can see, Dr. Joan Donovan is a leading public scholar and disinformation researcher specializing in media manipulation, political movements, critical internet studies, and online extremism. She's the research director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and she is the director of the Technology and Social Change Project, TASC. Through TASC, Dr. Donovan explores how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and generally disrupt society. TASC conducts research, develops methods, and facilitates workshops for journalists, policymakers, technologists, and civil society organizations on how to detect, document, and debunk media manipulation campaigns. Dr. Donovan is co-founder of the Harvard Kennedy School's Misinformation Review, and her research can be found in numerous academic peer-reviewed journals such as Social Media and Society, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Information, Communication and Society, and Social Studies of Science. She's a columnist at MIT Technology Review, a regular contributor to the New York Times, The Guardian, National Public Radio, and PBS, and she's often quoted on radio and in print. Dr. Donovan has laid out the philosophical frameworks for how to research, report on, and understand this moment in internet history and American politics. Her conceptualizations of strategic silence, meme wars, and media manipulation campaigns provide crucial frameworks for understanding how the US got to this point. She coined many of the terms that the disinformation research field and mainstream media use to understand technology's impact on society. And it also is fun to note that she is the co-creator of the beaver emoji. So with that, do please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Joan Donovan.
Thank you all so much. I hope that my video will be spotlighted so that you can see me. Let me see if I can just do that. Let me see if that works. Did that took off the screen share, right? Let me see. Oh no, screen share is still working. And then if I could just get a tech check just to make sure if one of the Davids, there were many of them, could help me just make sure that you're seeing my screen and you see a little picture of me.
Fine. I think this is good. Can we get a side by side? Yeah.
All right. Just let me know when you got it. How's that look?
Good to me.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Of course, I would love to have been there in person and to get to meet all of you, but some way, somehow, someday, we will be able to do that, I'm sure. And I'm like just completely overblown with that bio. I'm just a small town girl living here in Boston, watching the internet. And a little bit of background on me. I've been studying the internet for about 10 years, and I really value and think very highly of technology. I think about technology as a way to bring together different kinds of people to connect, collaborate, organize, deliver information. So I am by no means a dystopian thinker in this space. However, we are in a moment that I think you all can understand as being truly exceptional, truly different from anything we have as living beings have experienced in our lifetimes and can really only read about in history books. But we're living in a moment of pandemonium, as this talk will describe. And we have to think about, well, how is society and moral and technical order created in a moment like this? And so the talk I'm going to give today is a bit about the moment that we're in, a bit about technological adoption, and then really trying to get you to think with some of the tools in the exhibit about really how does this all play out? What does it look like to be seeing misinformation in your news feeds, and And ultimately, who pays for it all? Social media is free, of course. The gag is that you are the product. But that's no longer exactly true. The product itself has taken on its own source of value. And so we've moved beyond a moment where we can just say, all right, let's get on with it. And Facebook, boycott Twitter, get rid of YouTube. It's just, there's no going back. There's no tech nostalgia here. We have to move forward. And so this talk is really about this moment, and then would love to hear questions and comments from you about what might we do to get beyond this moment, and who needs to be called into the service if we are to take a whole of society approach, as I've advocated, to dealing with the problem of misinformation. But I want to talk a little bit about definitions before we get too further in, which is classic academic edition, definition of media, and it's an artifact of communication. It can be a book, a set of notes, a movie, a picture, really anything that is the leave behinds of communication. And then manipulation for us is to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. So we really want to get a sense of, in media manipulation campaigns, for studying them, what's being hidden from view? What's being lied about? What kind of, is it the account? Is it a set of fake behaviors like botnets? Is it the content that's telling a lie? Where is the manipulation is a frequent question of my team. And then disinformation, of course. Misinformation is simply false information that is circulating. And we're not concerned so much with someone is wrong on the internet. We're talking about misinformation at scale, which is when millions of people have seen the same wrong information and they think it's true. But disinformation is slightly more nuanced and definitely harder to capture, which is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. And why we hold out such a high bar for saying something is disinformation is because that little tricky word, intention, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to get into the, if you can really know a man's heart conversation, but we are able to deduce, intentionally false information campaigns by looking often on other websites for evidence of coordination. And right now, in order to get an algorithm to do a certain thing, like recommend your content, you still have to either generate a crowd, whether it's artificial and you get a bunch of people in another country to click on your YouTube video so that it raises higher in the rankings, or if you animate a crowd through the belief that somehow some kind of crisis is afoot and they have to share the information, or else something really bad's going to happen, like the fall of American democracy. I'll leave you to think about which side that might have called into action. But when disinformation mobilizes, you can be sure that there's really a nefarious set of politically motivated, usually, ends. We also see a lot of financial grift and a lot of financial content, financial hoaxes and grifts that sometimes will look like disinformation, but then be tracked back to an individual or a small group that is just kind of siphoning off people's names and reputations. So, for instance, if you think about the pandemic and you saw maybe some advertising for PPE online, a lot of times it was a financial hoax. And it was being used in such, it was, people were buying up anything they thought they could find on the internet, like Purell. And so there was a large market for a lot of false information and hoaxes. So this moment of the pandemic is very interesting because of the root word pan, meaning of all the people, the public in common, widespread, demos, district, county people. So a pandemic is something that is really about all of the people and really coming together across space. Whereas I think it's interesting to think about this moment, not just one of as a pandemic, but one as pandemonium. where it's also tinged with this moment of an evil spirit and this idea of inferior divine being, and tied very closely with thoughts of our destiny and what is it that we're going through in this moment, and all of, thinking through just all of the ways in which the people have been brought together using digital networks. And if you think back hard enough, you could remember March of 2020. But in that moment, all of us, like we are here, had been forced to use Zoom. And there was a lot of problems with it. We had students that were, we caught you. We had students that were dropping links to their teachers' classes into gaming forums saying, come Zoom bomb my class. And a lot of it was pranking and kind of in good fun. But then it started to turn, first as tragedy, then as farce, into real racist attacks on LGBTQ support groups, attacks on Alcoholics Anonymous, attacks on racial justice groups that were using Zoom. But it wasn't the case that Zoom turned away and said, oh, our product works the way it does, and it's too bad. If you don't like it, you don't need to use it. They worked with academics as well as industry researchers as well as government to figure out how to create a product that had much more security protocols built in. And as anybody in IT knows, it was really hard setting those norms and getting everybody on board with using those privacy settings. And it was only a matter of days when Zoom figured out that they could just turn those privacy settings on permanently, and then people would have to turn them off. And so we did see a decline in both the uproar about Zoom bombing, but also just the way in which the company thought about what it would mean to meet the moment rather than deflect in public media about the reputation of their product. Whereas we have a several year history now with other corporations, particularly Facebook, getting just hounded in the media for how their product harms different groups and spreads misinformation at scale. And sorry about that. And so this is a significant problem that we have to address when it comes to social media and the impacts that it has on just the general health and well-being of people, as well as the capacity for many of us to continue to do our jobs. It's not the case that we can just say, okay, turn off Facebook and all this energy goes away. That's not the case. And Facebook isn't the whole of the problem, but it certainly has played a unique role in the last 10 years of networking, terrorist groups, hate groups, extremists, political operatives, allowing for foreign interference in elections. And so there's quite a bit that we have to learn from the last just recent decade of technology history and internet history. So I think a lot with anthropology. I'm really indebted to the work of Chris Kelty at UCLA for this bit. This book he wrote, 2 Bits, The Cultural Significance of Free Software, where he talks about how geeks fashion together both technology, principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, with an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action. That is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. So it's not the case that Zuckerberg enters the world and says, I just want to invent something, right? They also are thinking about, well, how does technology change the world? Apple very much as well had an idea of how their products would be received by the world as a way to remake society. And down the line, as you look at different founding ethoses of companies, while at the same time you had geeks that were now at the helm, very capable of telling a very potted corporate history of technologies, we as academics can soberly reflect and say Facebook was essentially a website that allowed you to rate college women as if they were hot or not. YouTube originated as a dating site. So you'd be able to, just like the old days of VHS dating or party lines on the phone, you'd be able to upload a video of yourself to YouTube. Usually it was intended to be only 30 seconds or so. And you'd be able to talk a little bit about yourself and what you'd look for in a dating companion. People don't remember, though, that history of that beginning of YouTube. Twitter as well was meant to be short text messages that were visible to other people, but by and large was supposed to be just a way for people to connect and, you know, for other people to kind of join in the messaging. Of course, Twitter has now become a major place for the distribution of news, but also world politics plays out over Twitter, the way that people click and retweet and scream at one another, be they everyday folks or presidents of the United States. It's really important that we think about where these technologies have ended up when they begin from such modest intentions. As well, I wrote this article with, or this paper with Matthew Crane and Tony Nadler about the digital influence machine, which is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. And the reason why we wrote this report, which came out, I think, in 2018, was really to understand how the infrastructure of the internet, by and large, has been built by software engineers who are tasked with making things like profitable. And so advertising infrastructure underlays so much of what we call the internet these days, as well as, you know, you can think back to the 90s web browsers and banner ads and, you know, pop-up windows. But in this day and age, it's much more subtle. It's integrated directly into your feed. On BuzzFeed, you might be reading an article and not even realize that it's sponsored content. So all those cat memes, those are sponsored by Friskies. Doesn't make them unfunny, but you are being advertised to. And so it's really important that we look to the work of people like Sophia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression, to understand how the interests of advertisers are often at the forefront of what we consider the most important layer of our democracy, which is our information ecosystem. And so it's incumbent upon us to try to at least advocate for a digital public infrastructure that wouldn't be so wedded to advertising exchanges online. So who really pays for social media? Earlier on, I mentioned that if the product is free, the product is you. And Zuckerberg's made some interesting comments over the years. He said in October 2019, "I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy." Oh, if he had known about January 6th, right? If he had been able to predict the future, he probably wouldn't have made these decisions that he did in the lead up to 2019, in the lead up to the 2020 election, and what happened in January 2021, if he had, of course, a crystal ball. We're not asking technologists to be able to predict what the future capacities of their technologies are. I mean, the person who invented the 3D printer never really imagined that blueprints for a 3D printed gun would be circulating online and cause companies that sell 3D printers to have to register them in some states. And so that is a major change. He also said this in January 2020. He said, "In the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. We have based ours on the principle that people should be able to hear from those who wish to lead them, warts and all." And that, I think, is a really important statement about what he thinks the purpose of his technology is and how it orders moral and technical order or society itself, which is to say that he doesn't have really high expectations, especially of politicians. And we know now from the whistleblower leaks, of course, that they had whitelisted most influencers on their platform that had high follower counts. And so we never really could have expected them even to hold influential people to account, even if they weren't politicians. And that, I think, bears some thought as we realize who were behind the massive amount of election disinformation that we saw in 2020, as well as those in the background pushing for the overthrow of the election as it circulated in Stop the Steal groups on Facebook or through YouTube pundits and streams, and of course widely across Twitter. Which is all to say that it's not ultimately a question of who pays, not like the price tag of social media, but who pays the social costs, who pays for the rest of it. And so part of our research at the Shorenstein Center is focused on this media manipulation casebook, and I hope that professors here use it as a resource. It's really meant to be an open source textbook, and happy to loan out any of my researchers to guest lecture on any of the case studies in your classes. Just give us a heads up, but happy to have this stuff taught. But the idea here is to really think about, well, how does media manipulation happen? And if we can track it and it's a pattern, then how do we understand it and create intelligence out of what might be just simple incidents? So we think in a life cycle model. We think about, you might not be able to see this whole wagon wheel here, but stage one is thinking about how a manipulation campaign gets thought about or gets talked about initially in its origin phases online. And then stage two, we look at, well, how is it networked? How does it spread across the social web and across platforms? Stage three is really important to understand if something truly is, worth studying. We look at, well, what were the responses by industry, activists, politicians, and journalists to this attempted media manipulation campaign? Do they ignore it? Do they mitigate it in some way? Do they deplatform people? Do they remove content? So that's all like what we track in stage four is what were some of the mitigation attempts? Did journalists try to debunk it? Was it more than just talk? And then lastly, we look at the adjustments by the manipulators to the new environment. And I'll go through in a few minutes a case study on the pandemic and how that particular documentary circulated online and reached many, many millions of people. But when we think about, well, who pays the price then for for media manipulation, and we have to think about who pays for misinformation. And so I was part of a select committee on intelligence hearing a couple months back. This one was in October. There's the date there, October 15th, 2020. And it was a hearing on misinformation, conspiracy theories, and infodemics, which is the word that the World Health Organization is using to describe this moment as both a deluge of good information and bad information. So that's what an infodemic is. And then the subtitle was Challenges and Opportunities for Stopping the Spread Online. We didn't get to opportunities. I'm not going to lie to you. It was a pretty bleak discussion about the QAnon conspiracy theories and all of the different medical misinformation that was circulating. This is before we had a vaccine, so it was very turgid online in terms of the way that people were discussing potential cures. And we tracked down the hydroxychloroquine case and figured out that it was really a couple of Bitcoin guys that were at the helm really pushing that study and trying to get uptake of it across social media. It was truly fascinating. And we have the case study on our casebook website at mediamanipulation.org. So I'm going to go through a list of who pays for misinformation, talk a little bit about how each sector is kind of called in to really clean up the mess of, and remember, we're talking about misinformation at scale. We're not talking about misinformation that everybody's uncle knows, which is that the deep state has robbed his NFL team of the championship last year. Same story, different day, right? But when I think about it by sector. How many journalists have been had to write stories debunking misinformation? How many public health professionals have had to spend time explaining to the public that the vaccine doesn't make you magnetic? How many civil society leaders, how many law enforcement have had to deal with this? And so I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about that in terms of case studies. So one of our case studies had to do with the way in which journalists were targeted by a fake information collage that basically blamed the car attacker, James Fields. This evidence collage was collected by a bunch of online right-wing people, some associated with the alt right movement. And what they were doing is they just put together an infographic that made it look like they had figured out that the car attacker's name was actually this leftist Bernie supporter, that they had screenshots of his Facebook. And this guy's name, Joel V, was one of one in the name registry database. I mean, if you typed in his name online, you would get his social media profiles. And it did say that he owned a Dodge Charger, which was our Challenger, which was the car that was used in the attack. But this evidence was packaged up and put into a screenshot that was then put into the replies of journalists that were essentially reporting on the events, but were not in Charlottesville. And so that person, Joel V, ended up suing InfoWars and a few other outlets for spreading his name and falsely accusing him of a crime. But by and large, several journalists were tricked by this and did report the wrong information because it looked so much like it probably was this person when in fact they were nowhere to be found. And so journalists had to clean up that mess by debunking quite a bit of misinformation that day and in the following weeks, to the point where some people still believe it was some kind of cover up. Of course, you're not going to get everybody to be true believers of anything. But in this case, journalists really did pay the price. As well, we have case studies about how civil society really had to pay the toll here on misinformation that was starting to scale. There was this style of attack, which is called a butterfly attack, where people had made a bunch of accounts online looking as if they were Black Americans, and they were talking about this campaign they wanted to run called Operation Blaxit. And this idea was that Black people would post on social media that they were going to exit America and that they were going to go back to Africa. And of course, that sounds outrageous. Of course, some people do hold that opinion. But nevertheless, when you have a massive, not a massive, but a small amount of accounts kicking up the same dust on Twitter, you do get people starting to look in and wonder, is this a political campaign? Is this real? Is this what Black Lives Matter is calling for next? And so it tended to contribute to conservative outrage more than it did trick anybody that was interested in the Black Lives Matter movement into believing that Black Lives Matter was calling for the Black people to exit America. What instead it did was make it seem like that movement was foolish. And we often see this with fake accounts or sock puppet accounts. They use this style of attack where they might season those accounts over weeks by retweeting other, if it's LGBT groups, they might, or that they're trying to impersonate, they might retweet LGBT content. And then they kind of wait for their moment to strike. And we've seen this happen numerous times to the point where we can now call it in a quasi cybersecurity term, a butterfly attack. And we can say that, you know, when we see networks of accounts where people are using really contrived language and are being like overly provocative, we often think, is this some kind of a butterfly attack? As well, law enforcement. There was a misidentification that had happened in the Pacific Northwest, where online people were pushing this narrative that Antifa were out here setting fires to the Pacific Northwest on purpose. And the goal there was to basically declare a climate emergency and cause chaos. Now, of course, Antifa wasn't setting fires. Again, it was a version of a butterfly attack where imposter accounts were circulating this information. But real citizens, real people, decided that they needed to protect their neighborhoods. So they set up armed blockades, ordinary citizens, and were checking IDs as people came through their towns. And of course, law enforcement had to go in and tell people they needed to leave, that the fires were a real threat, that they can't act as quasi imposters of police. And so when rumors like this take on a certain scale and actually happen in a very local context, you don't need everybody to believe that Antifa is starting fires, but you can certainly cause enough chaos if, as a disinformer or a media manipulator, your goal is to upset a very local population in a moment of very intense crisis. And so these are the kinds of local disinformation stories that do really affect people in their everyday lives and the way they work, and also waste law enforcement resources who have to go into these very scary situations where they're, people are battling forest fires and they're dealing with people who don't want to leave their homes because they've been believing something completely erroneous. And so the last example I want to talk about before we take it into Q&A is to talk a bit about and go a little bit deeper on how do we do this research. So public health professionals have had to deal with more misinformation in the past couple of months than, last 18 months or so than I've ever seen. Now, of course, we have ways of understanding medical misinformation from the past, quackery. We talk about fake science or cloaked science, but something really different happened here with the use of mimetic warfare campaigns. So the tactic here was distributed amplification. I'm going to talk a bit about this documentary called The Plandemic. Now, online, that had already been people using scamdemic, demdemic, plandemic to talk about conspiracies related to the pandemic. Many of the conspiracies either allege that Bill Gates was at the helm or the Democrats were at the helm. But by and large, some nefarious force was largely in control. And it wasn't you, right? So you're just a normal user online, people hashtag plandemic, and you're scrolling through your day. So you see that hashtag a lot, and it's highly repeated. So the documentarians behind this movie, which stars a anti-vaccination activist, didn't invent plandemic. What they did was they co-opted the energy around this meme and named their documentary the Plandemic documentary, or the Plandemic. So they were able to get a lot of free advertising online for people that were already using that keyword, or were journalists monitoring that keyword for popular conspiracy theories and misinformation content. So what happened here is kind of interesting because it's an older tactic that we know that media manipulators often use, which is called distributed amplification. So what that is, it's a call to participants to rapidly and widely share sensitive or banned content on their personal social media accounts in an effort to evade platform mitigation efforts or dominate the information ecosystem with repetitive content. So we've seen this in a few other situations, one in a very playful way. This is a picture of the Malibu seashore, and that is Barbara Streisand's mansion. And she really wanted this picture removed from an ecological report that was online about erosion along the seashore. And the more she asked it to be removed and taken down, the more it went up online. So you might have heard of this thing in the world, like in internet studies, called the Streisand effect. And it's true. The more people are told that this is illicit content or information they shouldn't be sharing, they then become part of the game. and they want to see if the algorithms will take it down, or they want to see if they get caught. And so the Streisand effect has been what is labeled essentially this tactic of people re-uploading and redistributing things that might be considered illicit content that someone is trying to take down from the internet. Another way we saw it used was during the anonymous campaign against Scientology. There was this video of Tom Cruise talking very excitedly about his role in Scientology, and every time he tried to get it removed from the internet, Anonymous and others uploaded it to the tune of several million times. I mean, anytime someone tries to take it down, someone out there thinks, I just got to upload that today. And it's pretty amazing how long this video has stayed online. But nevertheless, the documentarians, or the makers behind, I don't even know if I'm insulting myself by calling them documentarians, but anyway, let's call them hoaxers, behind the Plandemic documentary, which reached millions of people on many different platforms. What they did was they marketed the video as illicit content, and this is from they created a website with a download link, and it says, our videos are being taken down every minute. We appreciate your support. More coming soon. And then in the fine print, it says, in an effort to bypass the gatekeepers of free speech, we invite you to download this interview by simply clicking the button below, then uploading directly to all of your favorite platforms. So the video itself was watermarked by different platforms so that anytime someone tried to upload it, it would be taken down. But nevertheless, it did go up for a couple of hours and was on this other website. And so it was really tricky because the platform companies were trying to delete it, especially YouTube. But at the same time, you had this army of people uploading it to the point where some would change the frame rate. They'd slow it down or speed it up. Other people took a video of their screen playing it so that the algorithms wouldn't see a perfect match and therefore wouldn't remove the content. And then it was downloaded into, translated into several different languages. But by and large, by the time the second version of the Plandemic, or the second iteration of it, came out, platform companies had figured out a pretty strong strategy for making sure that it didn't become newsworthy and deleting it as it was uploaded. But it did take quite a bit of coordination, quite a bit of work with journalists to get a sense of what are the real dangers here? What are the real stakes in doing nothing or taking action? And so that's some of the things I want to talk to you about today as we enter into discussion, is to think about, well, how do we get around this fact of disinformation, which is that everything open will be exploited, right? Every platform that allows people to sign up that doesn't have verification is susceptible to fake accounts. Twitter has gotten better over the years, Facebook as well, trying to have two-factor authentication. YouTube, you can upload any video and it has to be flagged if it's going to come down. Like, how do you guard against that if user generated content is the major the major point of circulation on your platforms? It's not the case that something like Netflix would ever run into this exact problem, although they are susceptible to public pressure in different ways, but they don't allow users generally to just upload any old thing. Although the quality of can we talk about the quality of these streaming documentaries? They're terrible these days. Anyway, that's an aside. Just trying to wake you up. So the last thing I want to say is that, like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people, and the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society orgs, politicians, educators, and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So I wanted to say thank you again, and we can open the floor for questions.
Okay, you should be able to hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
And can the audience hear me okay? I am on. Okay, great. So now I'd like to entertain some questions for Dr. Donovan. The good news is this room is wired now. There are mics in the ceiling. So if you stand up and project somewhat, it should be no problem that we can all hear you, including Dr. Donovan. Does anyone like to begin with a question?
Yes, my question might be, this has been happening for about 8-10 years now. I mean, what can we actually do? What's the, are there any recommendations you have to actually prevent this kind of activity? So I participated in some of it because it's internet fun. It's kind of what people in our generation do. Yeah, how do we stop that or learn from it?
Yeah, it's a big, broad question, and there are many different ways that we could approach it. This tranche of Facebook whistleblower files is the most amazing collection of industry research I've ever seen. And there might be a lot of liability in that. Looking means liability because the platforms did know quite a bit about what was happening on them and decided not to do anything. So that was an active decision, right? That was this. We know what's happening in these QAnon conspiracy groups. We know it's inciting people. We know that our recommendation algorithms are sliding people further and further into madness. I don't even think about it sometimes as a left and right issue. This QAnon stuff is like straight crazy when it comes to like when you start to dig down into it and look at what people are believing. So it's really important that we understand and settle some shared facts before we approach any kind of regulation. I think that Facebook whistleblower documents are really important in that case of building from a basis of shared facts. And yeah, trolling is funny. Sharing fake news is funny. One of the old, adages of the internet is like, why so serious? Right? Why do we take it seriously? And maybe it's the case that we need to demarcate and label better, which some people advocate for. That, the fact checking stuff started to backfire, though, because people do believe that posts that have been labeled as fact checked and kind of get the like bad seal of approval are not good, but that things that don't have a label must have been checked and been okay. And that's not good either. And, some trolling scholars like Whitney Phillips and Biela Coleman have argued is that, people participate in these kinds of campaigns because it's just fun. It's part of being online. It's part of networked activity. But we also have to think about like, well, some of this are people's workplaces. Some of this is really causing people to, a couple in Arizona ate fish food because they thought it had chloroquine in it because they were like getting their information not just from social media but also Fox News, and they thought chloroquine was the same thing as hydroxychloroquine. So you're not going to stop everybody from doing something dangerous, and that shouldn't be the point. But we should think about, well, what are the guardrails that we want social media to have? And we have to think outside of technological fixes. So a few technological fixes I've heard in the past that could be good is on Facebook, you're only allowed 5,000 friends. Maybe that's the great equalizer, is that you get your 5,000 pics and that's it. No more, no less for anyone. No more for me, no more for Selena Gomez. Like maybe that's the way it goes, right? Or we have situations in which there are tiered users, where if you have 100,000 followers on Twitter, you're treated more like a broadcast station and you're held to a higher standard, and that your posts are not necessarily reviewed at the outset, but that if you get a couple strikes against your account, yeah, like they're going to take you down, and it's going to be much more swiftly because you're connected to so many more people, rather than the opposite that Facebook has taken, where the more popular you are, the less they're going to hold you to account. The last thing I'll say here about the legislative remedies are vast, and some are more possible than others. The ones that relate to Section 230 are difficult because, when that law was made in 1996, you essentially didn't have high-speed internet. You had people, if you wanted an MP3, one song, it might take you 2.5 days to download. The law was made to protect people that like basically had email companies that didn't want to be caught liable if a bookie was taking bets over their platform, right? So they wanted immunity so that people could use their services. But we now need to think about, well, how are these services structured? What are the products that they're building? One of my favorite remedies here that's not an individual thing, but it's something that I think the regulator should consider is splitting up some of these companies so that they can't sell both advertising and be social networks. You have to pick one or the other, because if you own a social network, your only incentive is to collect data to sell to advertisers. And then those advertisers want tools that allow you to drill down into audiences so that you reach the people that are most likely to want your product. But that incentivizes horrible targeting practices, which is that there are a lot of civil rights violations that happen every day on Facebook, where people are, even if you split your ads by gender and say, I want my credit card to be so shown only to women, or if you send it to only people that are 19 to 30, or if you send it only to certain racial ethnicities, those are protected characteristics. And housing, credit, and jobs are really important opportunities that shouldn't be targeted in these ad exchanges. And so there's a lot that can be done, but from the perspective of a user, it's really just holding your friends and other people to account and saying, this is dumb, or, but like, I like to go to the mall. I like to go to the movies. Like, if I go on the internet and everything's like just news, then I don't want to go on the internet either. Right. But we have to think about, well, what is harassment? What is silencing other people? What is what's a bad action versus what is in good jest?
Let me just mention that I'm going to entertain live questions before we go to the Zoom. So another question, please project when you ask the question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Fascinating. So one thing, especially I noticed at the end of your speech that you talked a little bit about those who rely entirely on social media for their information. And I have a little bit of experience living outside of the United States, especially in places where Facebook has paid a disproportionate amount of money to have access, or excuse me, paid money to have a disproportionate amount of access to people's internet usage. So can you speak to the harm that disinformation does to people living in developing countries that really whose only means of accessing the internet are through Facebook and potentially reading misinformation on those platforms?
Sorry, so a little bit of the final part of the question cut out. So can you just quickly, just give me the last 20 seconds, or just recap very quickly the last part?
Yeah. Could you just speak to harmful effects that misinformation is having beyond the United States borders?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I work with a professor at the University of Amherst, Massachusetts Amherst, Jonathan Corpus Ong, and his research is phenomenal on how the disinformation for hire industry has activated in the Philippines. And essentially, you have people who work at social media influence firms, like they're just companies, and like they would do, spam for, get this, t-shirt or whatever, on sale over here, just as they would do spam for any odd product or, like stuff you would see online. They also utilize their accounts to spread political misinformation. And then one of the other ways that this company makes money is they'll take money from politicians, and they will then use it to make payments to low-grade social influencers that have maybe 50 to 200,000 followers on Instagram. So these are not people that matter to Instagram, but they're, much more trusted within their like very narrow sliver of the world than most people. Most people don't have that kind of reach. And so those people are being asked to share political misinformation. We also saw a reporter, I'm forgetting the outlet now, find out that in other countries like Vietnam, people were being asked to circulate medical misinformation for pay. And so we do know that in other countries, there are industries starting to develop. India as well is a really important piece of the puzzle here, because within India, you have people that work for the party that also work for Facebook. And there's been some really good reporting about the way in which those people who are political actors first and company men and women second shape the policies at Facebook to fit the needs of the party. And that's not unlike what happened here in the United States, where you had effectively Zuckerberg and Kushner reportedly on a handshake deal say, one won't change the other until the election's over. So politics by both in terms of the pay and in terms of the influence have significant repercussions. But when it comes to the social harms, I think we can talk even in broad universals here, in the sense that especially when it comes to, at least in the States, we've had a really hard time getting platforms to codify what they mean by hate speech. But in other countries, it's very clear that anything that is dehumanizing, that is comparing people to vermin, or are calls for mass violence against a certain class of people, those are strictly prohibited, both like in codified government law, but also the company tries to do much more in terms of removing that in other countries than it does here in the US. And so, but by and large, Facebook's content moderation, and I could say this for many companies, content moderation is an industry that needs to develop and needs to have serious workplace protections. But it also, as an industry, needs to get better at dealing with anything other than English, because right now, content moderation, I think Facebook only has 110 languages that it's doing content moderation in.
Another question from the audience that's here with us tonight?
Oh, don't be shy. Jump up.
Cindy, go ahead.
Go ahead, Charles.
No,
Cindy,
I just wanted to ask about the consideration that we hear a lot of free speech. Where does
That's-
all this fit in to the puzzle?
You got free speech online, like you got free speech at McDonald's at 2 a.m. There is a manager on duty, right? You're going to get kicked off if you're out here lighting up people and posting people's addresses and doxing people, putting people's credit card information up, like all kinds of things people do to get back at other people, like low grade, doxing. That kind of stuff is not anything platform companies will like keep up if they know that it's there. But you're talking about free speech in a generalist zone. It's, these policies within these companies are very specific. And so it's not always the case that like people's free speech is being taken away. Take the pandemic documentary, for instance. You have people marketing it as if it is serious scientific evidence-based information. And it's arriving in people's feeds through this engineering of the algorithm and trying to get a crowd to distribute it. And so in our field, we try to split content from reach, that is, content from the way in which it's distributed online. So you see in the Plandemic documentary, they have a web property. Very few web companies will take down websites. We saw it in the context of Unite the Right. The Daily Stormer website was taken offline by Google as well. The domain was canceled by GoDaddy. And that was because that site was being used to organize violence on, especially in the wake of the Unite the Right rally. They were trying to organize another rally in Boston for a week later. But you're right. There's a big speech question at the center of what do we do when we talk about the internet and when we talk about content circulation. And it's not the case that anybody's saying, monitor people's emails for this. But it is the case that if we are going to have open platforms, then there do have to be, at least right now, the law says platforms are in charge. And I think that that's probably a pretty good rule, but there might need to be some carve outs of Section 230 that deal with, well, when platform companies' products themselves are circulating that information. So maybe you post it, it gets to the people that are in your network, but then the recommendation algorithm picks it up. Is that a different form of speech? Right. And so these are live questions right now in Congress about recommendation systems. And what are the questions we should be asking and understanding about its relationship to free speech? Because free speech only goes so far. You get into the hotel lobby, you start yelling fire, you're going to get removed, right? So it's free speech is very much contextual, related to the spaces and places and conduits in which people are making that commentary. And so I'm not a legal scholar. Legal scholars will tell you everything in content moderation is illegal. They'll tell you like free speech first, and that's the end of that, and go home with your ball. I happen to hope that there's some kind of situation where we don't shift the burden to the rest of society for dealing with massive misinformation campaigns.
Thank you. Charlie?
Yeah, hey, thanks for the great talk. Would you mind talking a little bit about your methods? How you identify and uncover the structure of these misinformation campaigns?
Yeah, that is, it's a lot. So I have a very large team of people, and we use a few different things. One is we are ethnographers first and foremost. We watch the content. We watch the networks of people. So we have some low level data science that we might use to scrape certain hashtags on Twitter to get a sense of where they engineered. Some of these media manipulators, like the reason why we can map all these tactics is because they're so predictable. Certain media manipulators, like someone like Jack Posobiec, who often gets caught up in disinformation campaigns, he will tweet a hashtag and then spread misinformation and then delete the tweet within a couple of hours so that he's within Twitter protocols. But you can see like a lot of the hashtag campaigns that he initiates, they have signatures of being instantly shared by the same networks of accounts. Someone as prolific, but maybe you guys don't know him, Ali Alexander, that was behind the Stop the Steal campaigns, again, would have signature moves on Twitter where he would put up a Periscope video and you would see this kind of bloom of inauthentic accounts around them. So each platform really requires its own strategy for looking at it. YouTube, we just watch the content. There's really no way to, there's no good way to research YouTube in batches. But if something like Plandemic is happening, we want to know who's talking about it. So we'll watch some of the commentary. And one of the big findings from our research is that there's a lot of repeat offenders. Kate Starbird's lab over at UW as well uh, sees this, where you'll see a lot of collaboration from certain folks on different hashtags, cross-platform, different initiatives. 2016, it was much more like anonymous accounts, and there was a little bit more of almost like finesse around these campaigns and the lengths people would go to make a butterfly attack or a set of imposter accounts. I'm sure you remember, people online saying, I'm not a bot, right? When they were like part of bot networks that were like essentially like sometimes manned by people, but sometimes automated. Um, and so we just look and document and listen, and then we try not to go faster than journalism. So we might ping a reporter saying, are you watching this? Does this make sense to you? And then, we'll keep an eye on things, and then it's very strange because it's almost like now our research is so well known that people give us stuff all the time. They're like, I saw this crazy thing happening on this weird part of the internet. But uh, I mean, we're all friends here, but neo-Nazi message boards are a haven of where people coordinate this stuff. For a while, there were different Reddit groups that were just super clear about what their intentions were. They were going to annoy Hillary Clinton today, and they were going to get, her to shut down their, to block their accounts. And they were going in and, putting up images and trying to, get her to react. And sometimes it's just about getting a reaction. Sometimes it's much more in depth and has these serious, more like signature. Like, I'll tell you, one of the things that we notice is that if a campaign is truly organic, you will find traces of it in other places where people are recruiting folks to engage and are like, they're doing a lot of like mobilization work to get people to share things. But then when you see something as astroturfed or comes from perhaps another country where it was planned, it just kind of drops like a thud on the internet, and there's not a lot of signature way of seeing before it was. And then that's when you like really try to get deep into the data and get a sense of who's operating this network of accounts, and do they have they messed up anywhere along the way in such a way so as to would reveal a little bit about their location. One of the great studies on I'll shut up after this, on detecting these campaigns had to do with looking at time in Russia. What time is it in Russia? Is it normal working hours? And what's trending on Twitter? And you could see that people in Russia were being paid to basically manipulate Twitter trends, but it was only happening in the middle of the night, or manipulate Reddit and whatnot. And it was happening like clockwork. And so, unfortunately, when you start to dig into these things, you figure out they're not that sophisticated. They're not terrifically difficult to document, but you need to use the right combination of time and technique, which we can teach a version of this course in 90 minutes about how to jump into this stuff without using anything other than Twitter advanced search and like a browser extension called CrowdTangle, and you can get a good sense of like what accounts are working with other accounts and how they're all networked. Other questions? Oh, are you guys muted? I can't hear anyone.
Yeah, we got muted by accident. All right, please.
All right.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this during the presentation, but
Can you hear, Joan? Can you hear?
Yes, I can now. Thank you.
have you noticed a increase in misinformation stemming from the medium of podcasts, such as like Joe Rogan?
Oh, our boy Joe? Never. Never.
Or-
Oh, come on. Yeah, so Yeah, lots of podcasts, terrifically understudied. If anybody knows a good method for researching podcasts, I would love to know it because yeah, there's a lot to delve into in terms of podcasts. It's almost its own media ecosystem. And when we were looking at the growth of attention to Stop the Steal and voter fraud, we did turn our attention to some of these podcasts are simultaneously broadcast on YouTube. So when I mentioned someone like Steven Crowder, for instance, you can get his content on both places. But he was using, he was, out in front of some of these just asking questions type of misinformation spreading. So, you'll see on or hear on podcasts that misinformation as a, well, what if it was really COVID was really a bioweapon all along? That's a Steve Bannon particular trope. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to be reflexive. It's certainly okay to be critical of the pharmaceutical industry. They've done some dastardly things. But it's really like when we start to look at it and it becomes the kind of drumbeat of the content. It's not just like something wacky happened today and I want to talk about it. There's people that are out there trying to convince their audiences that they're under some kind of threat. And unless they buy this, supplement or toothpaste or prepper pack to get ready for World War III or gun, because they're like sponsored in different ways, or coffee, then there's like a kind of mix up of incentives here where they're, really pushing outrageous and novel content, and also making money while doing it. So there's an entire industry around these podcasts, particularly InfoWars, that is worth thinking about and understanding. I mean, Alex Jones has been at this for a long time. I mean, if anybody remembers the meme, 9/11 was an inside job. That was InfoWars. And so it's important that we understand that it's not necessarily just a matter of, oh, if we clean up social media, we clean up society, but rather that there's serious financial wins that these people are picking up because of the circulation of so much misinformation, and the scale by which they grow is astronomical now that there's no rules for broadcast online. You can't get away with the same stuff on radio, I'll tell you that much.
Okay, Steve, last one, and then we'll go to Zoom.
Yeah, so that was a good segue. I keep wondering about the economic aspects of this whole thing, and in particular, the sort of corporate to the individual spectrum. We talk about Facebook making money from it and then individual advertisers, but on these, what do you want to call it? But really, I have no problem with Friskies putting out cat feeds to sell you cat food. But these ones that are very destructive and pointed, is there any sort of corporate to that other than maybe state actors? Or is it really a very small coterie that very small number of people motivated and coordinated?
Yeah, it's both big and small. So within the networks that were sharing the big lie, you had some main stage actors like Rudy Giuliani that was soliciting political or financial donations to run this absolute like wacky legal strategy with. You had, Release the Kraken with Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood competing for donation dollars to try to, investigate the election outcomes. And so it comes in all stripes. I'll tell you, within the big uphill battle with the pandemic was really that you had these accounts of anti-vaccination activists that were, some of them upwards of 800,000 to 1 million followers on Facebook. We're talking enormous pages with enormous reach of people that know that when the page posts something that they should share it, because that's a duty they have to children and to protecting the earth and to guarding against big pharma. So you have all of these anti-vaccination activists that have spent the last decade or more drilling down on Facebook and really creating an infrastructure for the circulation of information and finances. I mean, these people are making tons of money. And so it was no surprise to me that the first thing that some of these anti-vaccination heads of these places did was they like made these books for Amazon that were about COVID-19 and surviving COVID-19. And they were, when you looked up COVID-19 on Amazon, it was like some of the first content you got was books, which were basically PDFs that they were selling about how terrible the pandemic is because it's hand of the deep state or big pharma trying to sell you something. And so there are different things that have happened to try to pull that content offline. And I think it was the I can't remember if it was the FCC or FTC really started to go after the fake COVID cures because they had become so profitable online, the colloidal silver and oleander, which were also being pushed by people like Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy. And so it was just like, you know, it's kind of like a free for all online. And when you talk about with Jonathan Korpis-Ong's research about these low level influencers that are 50 to 200,000 people, we see that happen a lot within places like QAnon communities where someone will be considered a good bread baker, like information gatherer. They used to call each other bakers anyway. They would gather all the breadcrumbs and people would donate to them because they would synthesize a lot of content and put it together in a good YouTube video. I shouldn't say good, but I meant like crisp and short. And so, yeah, so we're in a moment where information is a commodity and misinformation is profitable to a whole strata of people. And so one of the things about the research that we do is a bit like trying to hold back the tide. You know, you got two hands up against the ocean, but a lot is getting past. And it's because of the design of these systems. The Facebook in particular is meant to scale. All it's meant to do as a technology is scale information, is to connect people to people, people to content, content to content. And as a result, it becomes immensely profitable if you know how it works. And unfortunately, it can be really engineered because you know when people are in a crisis and they're looking for information, if they find your product or your podcast or your book first, they might just buy it because they don't know what else to do. Or conversely, we've started to see like email newsletters as well be utilized now as a space for this because Facebook isn't allowing so much of that content to flow through its networks. And so now we're starting to see a revival of newsletters, not unlike what we see with Substack, but with anti-vaccination content and political disinformation.
Okay, then we might go ahead and turn to the chat. So I think, Joan, you could probably click on that and see what's in the chat. Looks like there's 4 comments, and then we can.
Here. Oh, the one from James here I see is, would it be correct to say that disinformation is the root cause of misinformation? Is there anything you think can be done which is not being done to cut off the root? Are there policies in the US that people relied on to caution or punish people behind information manipulation, considering the caliber of people involved in the root? Well, it's a big question. You know, on our website, mediamanipulation.org, we have a research tab and we have this brief called the Deplatforming Index. All we're trying to see is like how corporations are dealing with this problem. And right now, Twitter is really suspending more accounts than any other platform related to the big lie. And we're talking about pretty high rank folks that are part of the Trump world that were spreading that information. The Dominion billions of dollars in cases that they've put out. So Dominion voting machines are suing individuals. They have a really good case for defamation against people that were spreading this idea that the Dominion voting machines were flipping votes for Biden, or were registering dead people, or were miscounting in some way. I mean, that's a real business with real interests that is not going to let Rudy Giuliani like tell a lie on them, because they're big business, even though they sell voting machines, which, you know, it's like selling slot machines in Vegas, right? Like, there's only a few companies that can do it. So it's really important that we understand that, like, while they're repeat offenders, because we're starting to see an industry develop around this, it's really important to think about not just the who of disinformation, but the scale of misinformation. And one of those pieces has to do with corporate accountability. So we can't have one without the other. We can't have regulation that asks these companies to rein in their products without also trying to make it more difficult for repeat offenders to keep doing this. But when it comes to government regulation, and I say this with a heavy heart working at a policy school, is that the government is very reticent to step into questions of speech. People have elected, you know, lots of maximalist supporters of the First Amendment, which is to say that they, in many conversations that I'll have with people in Congress, they will suggest that anybody should be able to say whatever they want online without repercussions, even content we don't like. And then I have to ask them, well, what responsibility does the platform have if they're delivering that information, not just to the people who subscribe to it, but also to the many, many people in which their products try to entice to stay on the platforms? And so we've made some headway there. The Congress is starting to think about, well, is recommendation different from organic reach? And does signing up for a thing make it different than being spammed a thing, which was in the past? We now have spam laws that make it, you know, not a crime, but there are some deep annoying penalties for creating spam networks. But it's going to take, you know, a really big approach, a really broad approach, all the way from, I would say, the telecoms industry up through the open web, to get at the many layers of the tech stack in which we might need enforcement. And we're going to have a big public conversation on, you know, is the open web the same thing as social platforms? If you're using algorithms to deliver content, do you have a transparency rule that has to apply so that the algorithms can be audited? You know, there's a lot of different ways this could go. And my hope is that people that are interested in technology in particular start asking these more heady questions about policy and even the philosophy here. We haven't broached the issue of ethics in technology design, but this is something that within Silicon Valley is being taught to all of these new engineers. There's a program that was put together by Mozilla to share syllabuses and product design so that people were equipped with an education coming out of computer science programs where they at least thought for a minute about what the power and the shape of the technology was that they were building, and how it might disproportionately affect different populations, either geographically or by race and ethnicity or by gender or by profession, right? There's all these different ways that you can slice the onion here to try to understand what the differences are. But I know I'm not making the problem any easier by just talking about it. And so our research is really formed around this. Lately, we're calling it the Democracy and Internet Governance Initiative, so DIGI. And what we're trying to do there is engage with policymakers, companies, especially their trust and safety teams, to get a sense of what's working internally at these different companies and what isn't, and where regulation might help, and where we need to call in some of our three-letter agencies like the FTC or the FCC or the SEC to make some determinations. And I think, like, we might be looking at a very long problem. We might be in this, science studies scholars think about infrastructure as a process rather than a product. Maybe the internet is something we remake every day. And that means that we need processual rules about how it should be shaped and what the guardrails should be, so that it's maintained like our hard infrastructure, like our bridges and roads. But we also think about the soft underbelly of the internet and try to think through, okay, well, how do we combat this problem if social media is in fact here to stay and we'll need to interface more with government in order to mark the clear threats that are happening because the platform exists, and what other parts should government leave alone?
Very well. It looks like we have one more question at the very top there from Sarah Green, and that should wrap us up. Top of this-
Oh, the societal immune system catching up with the threat, or will it? Yeah, I mean, Durkheim around, the idea of, society is like kind of a structural functionalist paradigm, and that society might figure out a way to deal with these threats, right? Society being the entirety of all of our institutions, both existing in contradiction with one another, but also some believe the arc bends towards democracy. I don't think that. I think we're going to have to fight like our democracy depends on it, to get tech to understand the role that it plays in both shaping our interests and our everyday lives, but also being shaped by the context of use. One of the things that I teach my students is how important political context is for innovation, because you've effectively seen over the last 4 years Facebook in a lock groove around its products, and really not being able to innovate in any way, anything that is remotely new. I mean, they just copycatted Clubhouse, and many people still use Instagram, but what you have with Facebook is you have this infrastructure where a lot of people built their initial social networks on it, but government right now is looking at, well, what would happen if you could port your data from Facebook and your relationships and your images and your everything over to another social media service? Would you do it, right? These are big questions. And if data portability is what we need to get that competition back in the space of social media so that there is innovation, then I think that could be a good thing. And that would be something that regulators could decide. But nothing good happens without a fight. And that's why I don't step back and say, okay, well, scholarship is a lonely game where we write our books and we write our articles and we think big thoughts. No, like, we are gonna, I just said this to Chris Krebs last week, but we're gonna bare knuckle box this. Like, this is it. Like, we got to love technology as much as we love each other, and really give a sense of what it means to be someone who's entrusted with so much power in our society. Like, Mark Zuckerberg is the highest paid content moderator in the world. And an attorney general in DC is going to charge him in a lawsuit because he's been making, like, basically his own calls on certain important questions about information integrity and free speech and what the product does. So I just really appreciate all the questions we had here today, and I want to thank everybody for listening to me. And hopefully some of you professors reach out if you want to have one of my researchers join one of your classes to talk about this stuff further. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for fighting the good fight. Everyone, please join in and thanking Dr. Donovan for the time. Thank you so much.